The tomb was silent, thick with the scent of death and roses. Dim candlelight danced on stone walls, casting long shadows over the pale form of Juliet, lying cold but not dead, her chest rising ever so subtly. Romeo knelt beside her, his hands trembling, a small vial of poison clutched in his palm. Grief had consumed him, and his voice cracked as he whispered her name, each syllable an agony of memory and loss. He leaned closer, brushing her cheek with his lips, eyes glistening with tears. Just as he pulled the vial to his lips, Juliet stirred. A faint gasp escaped her lips. Romeo froze. Juliet's eyes fluttered open, hazy, and slow. She looked around in confusion, then locked eyes with him. "Romeo," she whispered, her voice no more than a breath. The vial slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. He stared at her, breath caught in his chest. "Juliet? My love, is it truly you?" She sat up slowly, her limbs stiff and heavy from the effects of the potion. "Yes. I live. The friar gave me a draught to feign death, so I might escape this cruel fate. But, why are you here? Why?" Romeo wrapped his arms around her before she could finish, pulling her close as he buried his face in her hair. "I thought you gone. I came to die with you. But now, by some miracle, you've returned to me." Juliet trembled in his arms. "Then we must not waste this gift. Verona will not allow our love. We must flee. Now, before the sun rises." Romeo nodded, wiping his tears away. "Yes. Let this tomb be the place where Romeo and Juliet died to the world. Let us be reborn." They slipped from the crypt under the cloak of darkness, hiding beneath the veil of night. Romeo led her to a stable outside the city where he had once kept a horse. By luck or fate, it remained, and they rode swiftly, hearts pounding, the city of Verona shrinking behind them. As dawn broke, they passed the last familiar hills and entered a world that knew not their names. Days turned to weeks as they wandered southward, resting in woods, drinking from rivers, sleeping in barns and abandoned inns. They spoke little of what they had left behind, choosing instead to imagine what might come ahead. They traded jewels Juliet had hidden in her dress for food and lodging, and eventually arrived at a modest village far from Verona's reach. There, in the village of Montefiore, they took new names. Romeo became Luca, a stonemason's apprentice. Juliet became Elena, the niece of a seamstress. They rented a room in a crooked little house above a bakery, where each morning they woke to the scent of warm bread and the sound of pigeons. Juliet learned to sew and helped the seamstress with her work, her fingers quickly becoming deft with needle and thread. Romeo carried heavy blocks of stone in the quarries beyond the village, coming home each night covered in dust and sweat but smiling, always smiling, for he knew who awaited him. In the evenings, they walked the narrow paths between fields and vineyards, speaking of their new life. They dreamed of a cottage of their own, of children with names they whispered to each other under the stars, of planting olive trees and vines that would one day grow as strong as their love. But it was not always easy. There were days when Juliet wept in silence, thinking of her parents, of Tybalt, of the nurse who had loved her. Romeo carried guilt like a stone in his chest, haunted by Mercutio's laughter, by the blood of Tybalt on his hands. Sometimes, When he awoke in the night and found Juliet's side of the bed empty, he would rise in panic, fearing it had all been a dream. Yet every time he found her, by the window or in the kitchen with a candle flickering near her face, she would smile, and he would remember that they had cheated death, and that love had triumphed where swords had failed. 2 years passed. Their life in Montefiore became routine, familiar. The villagers accepted them as their own. Romeo Luca was known for his strength and quiet kindness. Juliet Elena was praised for her skill with the needle and her gentle manner. No one asked too many questions, and if their past ever whispered in the shadows, it never raised its voice. One spring morning, a rider arrived in the village. He bore no crest but carried the air of a man who had traveled far with purpose. He stopped at the tavern and asked if anyone knew a young couple who had come from the north, a man with dark curls and a girl with eyes like the sea. The baker's boy, not suspecting any danger, pointed him toward the house above the bakery. Romeo was in the yard, chopping wood when the man approached. "You are Luca?" the stranger asked. Romeo nodded, wary. "I am." The man studied him. "You are hard to find. But there are those in Verona who have not forgotten. The prince himself has declared you both lost to the city, presumed dead. But I have come with news. The Montagues are gone. Your father died of grief not long after your disappearance. And the Capulets have suffered too. Lady Capulet passed in her sleep. Lord Capulet is old, frail, and alone. Verona has changed." Romeo felt a hollowness open in his chest. "Why come now?" The man paused. "Because peace came too late. Your love may have ended the feud, but not in the way anyone wished. When you vanished, the families saw the tragedy they had wrought. The prince forbade further violence. Montague and Capulet both lost their only children and were left with nothing to fight for." Juliet appeared in the doorway, her hand on her belly, where new life stirred. Romeo turned to her, his heart thudding. The stranger followed his gaze. "You have built a new life. I see that. And perhaps it is better this way. I came only to deliver the truth." He turned and left, and the silence he left behind was deep. Juliet stepped into Romeo's arms. "What will we do?" "We stay," he said softly. "Verona is a ghost. Here, we live." In the months that followed, the seasons turned as they always had. Summer arrived with its golden heat, and the vines on the hillside ripened. Juliet gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Lucia, after light. She had her mother's eyes and her father's quiet strength. And so they lived. They built the cottage they had dreamed of. They planted trees and watched them grow. They raised their daughter with stories of love, not war, and never spoke of hatred. Occasionally, a traveler would speak of Verona, of how the city had changed, and Romeo and Juliet would listen with quiet hearts, knowing they had become something more than legend. They had become free. Lucia grew like the olive saplings that lined the path to their cottage, slender and strong, her laughter ringing like bells in the morning air. Romeo spent his days shaping stone into fountains and doorways, earning the respect of craftsmen and nobles alike. Juliet became known throughout the village for her embroidery, her hands weaving color and story into each garment. She embroidered flowers that only grew in Verona, stars they had seen on the night of their escape, and secret initials only she and Romeo understood. As their daughter grew, they began to teach her to read by candlelight. Romeo found old books at the market and brought them home in bundles tied with string. Juliet would sit with Lucia under the sycamore tree near the vineyard and trace her finger across each line, helping her sound out words. The child was quick and bright, full of questions, always asking about the world beyond the hills. One evening, when Lucia was 7, she asked them why they never spoke of their past. Juliet looked at Romeo, and he gave a slight nod. That night, by the fire, they told her a story not of themselves, but of two young lovers from a faraway city, torn by a cruel feud, who risked everything to be together. They told it as a tale, a myth. But Lucia, clever as she was, saw through the veil. "Was it you?" she asked, her voice quiet. Juliet ran her hand gently through her daughter's curls. "Does it matter?" Lucia leaned into her, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist. "No. It's a good story. And it has a happy ending." Romeo laughed softly. "Yes. It does now." Years passed like the shifting of clouds, slow and unnoticed until they were gone. Lucia became a young woman, as beautiful and fierce as her mother had been in Verona. Suitors came, drawn by her wit and kindness, but she showed little interest. She preferred to climb trees, help her father with stonework, and explore the woods behind their home. One autumn day, a letter arrived. It bore the seal of the Prince of Verona. Romeo hesitated before breaking the wax. He read the letter aloud to Juliet in the soft hush of their bedroom. The prince, now older and seeking to reconcile all ghosts of the past, extended an invitation. A ceremony was to be held in Verona in honor of peace, one that would memorialize those lost to the feud, including the children of Montague and Capulet. He asked that any who knew of their fate return if they still lived. Juliet stared at the letter for a long time, then took Romeo's hand. "What would you say, if we went?" "I would say we'd be ghosts walking through a city of memories. Maybe that's what we need. Closure." Lucia begged to come, sensing the truth in ways they had never fully spoken. And so, after much thought, they agreed. They packed light and traveled north, riding over the same hills they had once crossed in desperation, but now with calm hearts and steady eyes. Verona welcomed them in golden twilight. The city had changed, as cities always do, but the bones were the same. The Capulet house stood silent and ivy-covered. The Montague estate had become a public hall. Juliet and Romeo walked through streets once soaked in blood and tears, now full of laughter and trade. They attended the ceremony in masks, sitting among the crowd as strangers. The prince stood on the steps of the old cathedral, speaking of the past. He spoke of senseless hatred, of young lives lost, of how pain had birthed wisdom. He spoke the names of Romeo Montague and Juliet Capulet with reverence, as symbols of love's endurance. A statue was unveiled, two figures standing hand in hand, gazing not at each other but outward, toward the future. Lucia wept. Later, as the crowd dispersed, the prince noticed the three of them watching quietly from the edge. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in recognition. He approached, slowly, and said nothing until he stood before them. "I knew," he said at last. "Or at least, I hoped." Romeo lowered his mask. "We are no longer them." The prince nodded. "Then I shall never speak your names. Peace be with you." They returned to Montefiore without ceremony, their past folded neatly into the chapters of history. Lucia, with a deeper understanding of who she was, chose her own path. She married a poet from Siena and moved to the coast, writing letters home that brimmed with joy and longing. Romeo and Juliet grew older together. Their hair grayed, their steps slowed, but their love never dimmed. On quiet evenings, they sat side by side beneath the tree where they had once taught Lucia to read, watching the wind ripple through the fields. Sometimes they spoke of Verona, not with bitterness but with bittersweet nostalgia. They had fled death together, survived by love alone, and built a life from its ashes. And one winter morning, long after the olive trees had thickened and the vineyard had changed hands, Romeo passed quietly in his sleep, his hand still in Juliet's. She did not weep. She sat with him through the morning, whispering stories into his still ears, stories of Montefiore, of Lucia, of the sunrises they had watched and the dreams they had shared. Then she closed his eyes, kissed his brow, and walked to the window. She lived on for a time, her days gentler, quieter, filled with memories and the scent of rosemary and stone. She would sometimes speak aloud, as if Romeo still sat beside her, and perhaps in some way, he did. When she died, it was in the same bed, with the same calm grace, a smile on her lips and her hands folded across her chest. The villagers buried her beside him beneath the sycamore tree, and carved a simple stone. Here lie Luca and Elena. Lovers, parents, builders of peace. They loved truly, and lived fully. In the years that followed, the story of Romeo and Juliet faded into legend, the true ending known only by a few. But in Montefiore, people still speak of the quiet couple who once lived above the bakery, who built fountains and embroidered joy, who laughed often, and loved more. And though the world remembers them as tragic figures, doomed by fate, their true legacy was far greater. For they did not die in Verona. They lived. In the seasons after Juliet's passing, Montefiore seemed to breathe differently. The wind down from the hills grew softer, and the villagers often said that the olive trees near the old sycamore swayed more gently than the rest, as though honoring something sacred. Lucia returned for the burial, standing still and silent beneath the rustling canopy, her face unreadable but her hands clenched around a pressed wildflower her mother had once dried in a book. She remained in the village for several weeks, tending the cottage, restoring the garden her mother had loved, and walking the paths her father had carved through the fields. In the evenings, she sat at the window her mother used to stare through, reading from the old books they had left behind. One night, she opened a chest beneath the bed and found letters bundles wrapped in ribbon, some yellowed with age. Letters between Romeo and Juliet, written in secret during the early days in Montefiore, when even together, they had feared being torn apart. Each letter whispered a world Lucia had only imagined, and as she read, she wept, laughed, and sometimes sat for hours staring at the last line of a page. She learned how her parents had struggled in those early years, how Juliet had suffered nightmares of the tomb, how Romeo had battled guilt for Mercutio and Tybalt. But above all, She read of love unshakable, desperate, triumphant. Inspired, Lucia began writing herself. At first, it was a simple account of their story, but the words grew and twisted into a tapestry far larger than she expected. She no longer wrote just for herself, but for the world. Her parents had fled legend, but she would return to it not to reveal their names, but to restore the meaning of their love. She titled the manuscript The Garden of Names, and each chapter bloomed with memory. She returned to Siena but traveled often between the two homes. Her poet husband, Matteo, supported her work and often joined her under the sycamore, pen in hand, composing verses beside her. Their bond echoed what she had seen in her parents, something not perfect, but enduring. Over the years, The Garden of Names was copied by hand and passed through literary circles. Though it never claimed to be truth, readers spoke of its intimacy as if the writer had walked the world beside the characters. Some said it was the true ending to the famous tragedy, told in metaphor. Others called it fantasy. But among those who knew the author's eyes like the sea, full of history, there was no doubt. Lucia's fame grew quietly, not like fire, but like roots deep, patient, inescapable. She was invited to Florence, then Rome, then Venice. She declined many of the invitations, preferring the rhythms of Montefiore, the quiet scratching of quill on parchment, the olive press groaning in the distance. Eventually, she and Matteo purchased the cottage. It remained exactly as it had been. The table still bore the notches of Romeo's carving knife, and the wardrobe still smelled of lavender and cedar. They restored it lovingly and added a small annex where scholars could visit, not to see relics, but to walk the land her parents had once tended. It became a place of pilgrimage, not of spectacle, but of reverence. One winter, a young scholar from Verona arrived. His name was Benedetto, and he had read The Garden of Names by firelight during his youth. Now a lecturer of literature, he had followed every hint and metaphor until it led him to Montefiore. He brought with him a gift, a copy of the original Romeo and Juliet, the edition used by bards in Verona's theaters, with margin notes and pressed violets between the pages. Lucia invited him to stay for supper. Over roasted chestnuts and warm wine, Benedetto confessed that the play had always haunted him. "It is beautiful," he said, "but it is hollow. I've always felt as though the end was torn away." Lucia looked at him over her cup. Some endings are not the ones the world remembers. But that does not make them less true. He gazed at her for a long moment, then quietly set a sealed envelope before her. "A personal letter, passed to me by a very old librarian in Verona. It was hidden in the archives of the Capulet estate." Lucia opened it with trembling hands. It was written in a bold, uneven script. The ink was faded but legible. It was a letter from Friar Lawrence, addressed not to anyone in particular, but to posterity. In it, he described the events leading up to Juliet's false death, his desperate hopes, and the horror upon learning what might have happened in the crypt. But in the final lines, he wrote something curious. "I did not see their bodies. The tomb was empty when I returned days later. Perhaps the gods took pity. Or perhaps love did what we men could not." Lucia read it aloud, her voice quiet and reverent. When she finished, silence filled the room. Benedetto set down his cup. You don't need to tell me who your parents were. I already know. Lucia smiled. Then you must promise to keep it. I will. But the truth will out, in time. Let it, she said. But gently. Years passed like pages in a book. Lucia and Matteo grew older. They had children, 2 daughters and a son. The eldest, Rosa, inherited her mother's curiosity and her grandmother's strength. The youngest, Pietro, was a sculptor like his grandfather, often spending hours chipping at marble beside the cottage. By then, the world had changed. Plays were no longer forbidden in some regions, and Romeo and Juliet saw a revival in Florence. Audiences wept, still, at the lovers' fate. But quietly, a new tradition began. In some performances, after the curtain fell and the stage dimmed, a second scene played: a garden, a cottage, a man and a woman walking hand in hand beneath olive trees. They had no names, but everyone knew. Lucia lived to see this shift. She was 90 when the first of those performances reached Montefiore, performed by students in the village square. She watched from her chair beneath the sycamore, Matteo at her side, their children and grandchildren gathered around. And as the actors bowed, the crowd stood, not for the tragedy, but for what came after. For life. For love. Lucia died not long after, surrounded by family. She was buried beside her parents, her stone marked simply, Lucia, daughter of peace, teller of truths. Her legacy endured through her children, through every copy of the Garden of Names, and through the quiet, enduring presence of the cottage that had once sheltered 2 lovers fleeing death. And though time wore away at the stones, and the vines grew thick, the story lived on. Not in Verona, but in Montefiore, where love had fled, bloomed, and remained. The children of Lucia inherited more than names and faces; they inherited silence and legacy. Though their parents had spoken only in fragments, and their grandparents never revealed who they had truly been, the air in the house on the edge of Montefiore always carried a weight of myth. Rosa, the eldest daughter, was the first to ask questions. As a child, she wandered the garden asking why her mother sometimes looked east with longing, or why visitors always seemed to speak softer in the house than anywhere else. At 13, she discovered an old bundle of letters tucked into a drawer her grandmother had once sealed shut. She didn't read them not out of fear, but respect. She simply stared at the handwriting for a long time, then rewrapped them and placed them back. She knew enough. Rosa never married. She became a scholar of languages, traveling to Florence, Bologna, and eventually Paris. She taught at universities and wrote essays that tied together oral histories, poetic traditions, and romantic archetypes. Without ever naming her lineage, she built a body of work that echoed one message across every page: true love is not marked by tragedy but by the courage to choose peace. Her sister, Bianca, married a merchant from Genoa and had 5 children, filling their coastal villa with life and laughter. But she always returned to Montefiore in the summer, bringing music and fresh caught fish, and sitting late into the evening with her father, Matteo, as he aged. She kept her mother's stories alive through lullabies and firelight tales, each one shaped just enough to be legend, never confession. The youngest, Pietro, remained in Montefiore. He was the one who took over the house, expanded the vineyard, and became known for sculpting angels that appeared in churches from Siena to Naples. What few knew was that in the center of the grove where the sycamore stood, he crafted something secret, a marble bench shaped like an open book, its pages etched with lines from his grandmother's writings. On the final page, a single phrase, in Latin: Amor vincit mortem. Love conquers death. He never signed it. He didn't need to. As generations passed, the family splintered across Italy and beyond. But somehow, the house in Montefiore endured. It was never sold, never truly empty. Even when wars shook the land, when kings fell and revolutions flared, someone always returned to keep the doors open and the olive trees trimmed. In the mid-1800s, a writer named Elisabetta Valeri visited Montefiore by accident. Her carriage broke an axle outside the village, and she was forced to stay for 2 days. Intrigued by the place, she wandered its paths and eventually came upon the bench in the grove. The quote haunted her. She asked the villagers about it, but no one gave her a straight answer. Some said it had been built by a mad sculptor. Others said it marked the grave of a saint. But one elderly baker told her, that bench holds a story older than the vines. And if you sit long enough, the wind might tell it. She stayed for 2 weeks. When she left, she carried with her a seed of inspiration. 5 years later, she published The Lovers of Montefiore, a novel that blended history and fiction so seamlessly the world couldn't decide which it was. In it, 2 lovers flee a great city torn by feuds, find peace in a hidden village, and raise a family whose descendants shape the culture of Italy. The book became a quiet sensation. At first, literary circles dismissed it as fantasy. But as readers pored over its passages, cross-referenced its events, and explored its hidden clues, theories began to circulate. Some whispered that The Lovers of Montefiore was not fiction at all, but the true ending of Romeo and Juliet, buried by time and protected by love. Universities debated the theory. Plays began adapting the Montefiore ending as an alternate epilogue. Even in Verona, once rigid in its traditions, a movement began to honor the possibility that love had outlived the tomb. A marble plaque appeared in the old Capulet crypt. And if love outlived the tomb, let this stone remember it. For what is death to those who choose life? More visitors came to Montefiore. Some were tourists, others pilgrims, but all arrived with quiet hearts and reverent eyes. The family, now spanning many names and cities, returned often to guide visitors gently, ensuring the story was honored, not consumed. By the 20th century, the house was preserved as a historical residence. Not a museum, never sterile, but a living home, filled with worn furniture, family portraits, and a still working kitchen. On certain nights, poetry readings were held beneath the sycamore, and candles were placed along the path. Students came to study love, loss, and resistance. Writers came to remember what stories could heal. And still, the original manuscript of the Garden of Names remained in a locked drawer in the old bedroom. One day, it would be opened again. But not yet. Because the descendants of Romeo and Juliet were not done living. They had become healers, teachers, poets, masons, and musicians. They married whom they wished, traveled where they pleased, and wrote their own stories. Some never learned the truth of their ancestry. Others guessed, but chose silence. It was not shame that kept them quiet, but something deeper. A reverence for the life their forebears had fought to protect. A life that was never meant for stage or spectacle, but for peace. In the year 2025, a filmmaker named Livia Torres began a documentary on lost Italian legends. While researching forgotten villages, she came across Montefiore. The more she asked, the more evasive the locals became. But her curiosity only grew. It wasn't until an elderly sculptor named Johnny showed her the bench in the grove that she began to understand. "I'm not saying it's them," Johnny said, brushing olive dust from his hands. "But I'm saying love like that doesn't die. It roots. It grows. It becomes all of this." He gestured around them: vines, stone, laughter in the distance, the golden haze of a Tuscan afternoon. Livia spent months filming. She never confirmed the names. Never uncovered a tomb. But she captured something else, a pulse beneath the soil. A quiet revolution born not of war, but of two people who chose to live. When the documentary premiered in Venice, audiences sat in stillness as the screen faded to black. No credits. No narration. Just the sound of wind through trees and the words. They lived. In the year 2093, the world had changed once more. History had been digitized, culture fragmented and recombined into endless streams of data. Cities gleamed with glass towers and vertical gardens, and archives no longer lived in dusty libraries but in code and clouds. Yet even amid this technological age, there were stories no algorithm could explain. One of those was the enduring legend of Montefiore. It still stood, nestled between the hills of Tuscany, its stone cottages untouched by time and its vineyards carefully tended by hand rather than machine. And in the old house beneath the sycamore tree, the bloodline of Romeo and Juliet still ran through the veins of a young woman named Aurora Benedetti. Aurora was 25, an archivist and digital restorer working for the Global Museum Network. She had been born in Montefiore but raised in Florence, where she learned to scan and decode lost texts, to restore memory from dust and ruin. Though she had grown up surrounded by stories and whispers, no one ever told her the full truth. Until she returned one summer to the house. Her great-aunt Letizia, the last of the direct custodians of the Benedetti home, was nearing her final days. Frail and luminous in equal measure, Letizia asked Aurora to come alone. When she arrived, Letizia led her to a chamber hidden behind the wardrobe in the old bedroom once Lucia's. There, in a wooden case sealed with iron clasps, rested the original manuscript of the Garden of Names. "You are the first of your generation to know what it is," Letizia said, her voice a rasp of breath. "You must decide what becomes of it." Aurora opened the case with reverence. The parchment pages were well preserved, though faded. She scanned each one using her restoration lens, watching the text bloom beneath ultraviolet light. What she found was staggering: not just poetry and prose, but maps, coded lineages, annotations in Juliet's own hand. There were marginalia from Romeo, subtle and strong, sometimes just lines of poetry written sideways in the margins. The manuscript was not just a book. It was a key. Aurora returned to Florence in a storm of thought. She didn't sleep for days, decoding, transcribing, connecting fragments long believed fictional. The more she uncovered, the clearer the truth became. The play by Shakespeare had told the beginning of a tragedy that never completed itself. The real story had been buried, quietly tended by generations of guardians. And now it was in her hands. What should she do? If she released it, the world would change. Scholars would rewrite hundreds of literary histories. Verona would become more than a stage, it would become a case study in historical distortion. But more than that, the memory of Romeo and Juliet, as the world knew them, icons of doomed love, would be forever transformed. Would it diminish the legend? Would it cheapen what her ancestors had protected? Or would it finally, at long last, set them free? She visited the cottage again in autumn. Letizia had passed quietly in her sleep, as many in the family seemed to do, and the house was now hers. She walked the olive paths in silence, stopping at the marble bench Pietro had carved 2 centuries before. She placed a hand on the stone and whispered to it, "I know your truth. What would you want me to do with it?" The wind stirred gently through the leaves. Aurora sat down and stared at the horizon. That night, she wrote a letter. Not to an editor. Not to a publisher. But to her descendants, whoever they would be. She explained the story. Not in facts, but in feelings. She described how Juliet's letters still smelled faintly of pressed herbs, how Romeo's sketches of her face were hidden in the backs of books, how Lucia's voice lived in every word of the Garden of Names. Then she did something unexpected. She encrypted the letter and the scans into a sealed archive, set to unlock only on a certain condition: if within the next 100 years, someone asked the question with sincerity. What if Romeo and Juliet had lived? Only then would the truth reveal itself. She placed the encrypted file into the Global Folklore Archives under the title, A Rose Beyond Verona, Code Fragment 33R&J. It was catalogued with other unsolved historical entries, some real, some imagined. Then she returned to Montefiore, where she lived simply, tending vines, teaching children, and writing essays that guided others toward truth, but never forced them upon it. Decades passed. Aurora grew older, but her eyes remained bright. Tourists still came, and she welcomed them with warm bread and stories, some true, some not. One child once asked her if Romeo and Juliet had ever really kissed under that tree. She smiled and said, "Many people have." In the year 2175, a young historian named Mila Genovese accessed the Global Folklore Archives during a search for alternate endings in literature. Her research focused on the evolution of tragedy and how modern society reinterpreted myths. When she came across the file labeled 33R&J, she paused. The entry had no metadata. No author. Just one line. They lived. Mila activated the trigger manually, bypassing protocol, driven by curiosity and a strange ache in her chest she couldn't explain. The archive unlocked. The letter appeared. Then the manuscript. Then the genetic family tree that led all the way to Montefiore. She sat in silence for nearly 2 hours. Then she booked a flight to Tuscany. Montefiore still stood, and though Aurora had passed 20 years earlier, The cottage was still preserved, maintained by the village with devotion. Mila walked the olive grove, sat on the marble bench, and opened her reader. She began to cry. Not because the story had changed, but because the story had finally arrived. She did not publish it immediately. She wrote an article, carefully worded, proposing a possibility of historical truth behind the legend. She cited the manuscript, referenced Aurora's archive, and invited readers to visit Montefiore for themselves. And they came. Not in throngs, but in pairs. Lovers, scholars, the lonely, the broken-hearted. They came not for spectacle, but for understanding. Because now, the world believed what it had only hoped for before. Romeo and Juliet had lived. And in that living, they had given the world something greater than tragedy. They had given it peace. In the first year of their life in Montefiore, Romeo and Juliet were still learning how to breathe freely. Their little room above the bakery was modest, one narrow bed with a wooden frame, a wash basin near the window, a crooked table with only one chair. The floor creaked when they moved, and the ceiling leaked when it rained. But in that space, they experienced their first true moments of peace. Each morning, Juliet rose before dawn to help the baker's wife knead dough. Her fingers, once delicate and idle, became strong and flour-dusted. She would return quietly as Romeo stirred, her face glowing with warmth and flour-smudged cheeks. He would wrap his arms around her from behind, pressing his forehead to her shoulder, and whisper, "Tell me it's not a dream." "It isn't," she would reply. "Because I can feel your breath." They ate simple meals: bread, olives, goat's cheese, roasted vegetables. Sometimes, Juliet would steal an extra fig from the market. Sometimes Romeo brought home a handful of wildflowers from the quarry paths. They collected little things, feathers, pressed leaves, pebbles with curious shapes. They had nothing, and yet every corner of their home was filled with quiet tokens of love. Juliet once said, "Do you think we're selfish? To have run away while others suffered behind?" Romeo had sat in silence before answering. "I used to wonder the same. But I realized something. Our suffering would not have saved them. Only the example of our peace can." He built a small shelf above the bed from discarded wood, and together they placed a candle, a book, and a carved stone from Verona, a fragment from the Montague estate wall, broken during one of the family feuds. They kept it as a reminder. Juliet kept a diary. She wrote at night, seated cross-legged on the bed while Romeo snored softly beside her. At first, it was simply a record of events. Then it became reflection, then poetry. She wrote of the scent of rosemary on Romeo's skin, the way the sunlight caught in the dust of the bakery, the sound of the church bell on rainy mornings. In one entry, she wrote, "Today I realized what love is. It is not fire, nor thunder, nor agony. It is bread rising in a warm oven. It is hands that return. It is silence that does not frighten." During their second year, they moved to a cottage offered by the seamstress Juliet worked for, who had grown to love the quiet, serious couple. The house had 2 rooms, a vegetable patch, and a sycamore in the back. That tree became their sanctuary. They often lay beneath it, heads touching, hands entwined, watching birds pass overhead. Sometimes they spoke of their past of Tybalt, Mercutio, the crypt. Other times they invented stories of who they might have been in another life. He, a painter. She, a sailor. Once, Juliet told Romeo she would have liked to be a beekeeper. He laughed and said, "Then I would be your honey thief." Their laughter healed the wounds of their youth. But not all wounds healed cleanly. There were nights when Romeo woke with a cry, drenched in sweat, reaching for Juliet's hand as if afraid she might vanish. She would hold him, whispering the same words over and over, "We are here. We are here." And he, in return, would stroke her hair when she woke from dreams of stone and darkness, remembering the tomb's cold embrace. They did not forget their past. They forgave it. In the 3rd year, Juliet conceived. The news brought both joy and terror. They feared exposure, feared the child inheriting the pain of their names. But as her belly grew, so did their confidence. Romeo would rest his ear against her skin, whispering stories to the child inside, stories of stars, of peaceful places, of love so strong it could reshape fate. Lucia was born on a warm spring morning, with birds singing and the smell of rosemary in the wind. Juliet wept as she held her, and Romeo did not speak, only touched the child's tiny hand with reverence. They raised her with quiet courage. They taught her music, letters, how to listen to the wind and how to walk without fear. Romeo carved a wooden horse for her first birthday, and Juliet sewed her a tiny blue dress embroidered with ivy leaves. They taught her the value of truth, but not yet the truth of who they were. Not until Lucia was ready. And when she was, she accepted it not as a burden, but as a flame to protect. She promised never to speak of it unless it was with love. As the years passed and Lucia became a young woman, Romeo and Juliet watched her with quiet awe. She had inherited Romeo's thoughtful nature and Juliet's fire. When she laughed, the house felt warmer. When she asked questions, the sky itself seemed to lean closer to listen. One evening, as they sat together beneath the sycamore, Lucia looked at them both and said, "Your story, what you did, it wasn't only for love. It was for peace." Juliet turned to her with tired, shining eyes. "We didn't know it then. We only wanted to live. But yes, perhaps peace was the result." Romeo added, "And you, my little light, are the proof of it." Later that night, Juliet took Romeo's hand as they lay side by side, their daughter sleeping in the next room. "If I die before you," she whispered, "promise me something. Anything. Don't grieve. Plant an olive tree for me. Something that will live longer than grief." Romeo nodded. "And when I join you, I hope the tree will still be growing." When Juliet did pass years later, quietly, without fear, Romeo did as she asked. He dug the earth with his bare hands and planted an olive tree beside the sycamore. Then he sat beneath it every evening until his own final breath came, soft as wind through the leaves. Lucia, watching from the window, understood then that she was the steward of something precious. Not a legacy of rebellion, but a legacy of choice. Of life over death. Of love over pride. Of peace over name. And so she continued the story, not with trumpets or monuments, but with pages, letters, whispers, and laughter passed down through kitchens, over dinner tables, beneath stars. And the story, like the tree, continued to grow.